welcome. We're here to look at how the pros prepare, when in fact, what we're going to look at this night is how to prepare like a goat. And the first game actually is sort of an Easter egg, because you may think you're looking at one goat when in fact there is two. But this time, the one on the receiving end is a goat himself. Garry Kasparov needs no introduction, nor does Vishy, but I will elaborate that in a moment. So whenever you're preparing for a game, it really boils down of understanding of what position you're trying to have or you're trying to accomplish. So let's dig in. So e4, c6, d4, d5, this is the Caro-Kann. Very popular in some decade ago, and it is still fairly popular, although e5, so e4, e5, and e4, c5 is surpassing it in popularity. However, it is still very popular. d4, d2, bishop f5, the main line, even though Karpov against Kasparov himself did go knight d7 with some success, including his famous win against Gatakamsky. Bishop f5, bishop g6, h4, knight f3, h5, bishop d3. Now notice that white is trying to win as much time as possible, and he's also trying to fix black's structure on the king side, and that actually will become quite important towards the middle game. Bishop f4, e6, bishop e7. Now bishop e7 signals that black actually considers going short, when before queen a5 check used to be the big line. So instead of e6, queen a5, here queen c7 and castles, long castles, and this used to be the big main line. But since then, they switched over to e6, bishop e7 with the intention to castle. So whenever you prepare for a position, you kind of have to decide what you're aiming for. Black, in fact, decides to choose a structure that is rather sound, yet fairly passive, because white is the only one with quite a lot of space, although there will be a controversial question whether the h-pawn is a strength or weakness. So that's sort of another reason why Caro-Kann players like playing their variation, because the h5 pawn actually can become a target. So king b1, castles, knight e4, preparing the idea of g4, which in fact was played in a game between Judith Polgar and Vishy himself. Knight takes e4, this is the most solid. Queen takes, knight f6, queen e2, queen to d5, knight e5, queen e4. And the big question is, what would you do? Would you trade? Would you try to avoid the trade of queens? It's actually a very important question, and it's something that definitely both Garry and the other players I'm going to talk about looked at. Because you have to decide before you actually go there and play your game, what will be your game plan? Are you going for an all-out attack, or are you content with a position with a slight bit of a pull? Should we take? Should we block? We could also consider queen d2. However, I haven't really seen that move being played. So we've got plenty of people trying to avoid. Would you avoid or would you trade the queens? Trade? Okay. Why would you trade, by the way?
Because I'm not a very strong player, so trading queens against a great is always desirable.
Okay.
That's not a good reason.
So,
but you're,
no, it's a good reason. You have your own reasons, and that's completely valid for you. That's great. Trading because you're trading against a very good player. Now, that is correct. And Garry actually goes into the ending. Now, bishop e3 does feel very combative, but it turns out that knight d5 and black gets very comfortable counterplay against the bishop, and the spin is actually kind of annoying. Queen takes e4. So what Garry decided, and decided early before he even entered this game versus Vishy, that this ending is favorable for him. It's a very nice position. Knight takes e4, rook e1. You can't quite take this, it's poisoned, because there's rook d2, and I'm going to pick up that knight. The knight cannot really run away. Knight f6. So it's one thing to consider a position advantageous, but there are some strategic elements that makes this position quite favorable for white. What could be a reason white can claim some advantage? In fact, it is deeply connected to that h-pawn. As black is threatening our pawn on h5. The extra space is nice, very good. However, if you look at the position, white has an extra pawn here on the queen side. Black has these guys, while black has a majority on the king side. However, there's a huge difference between the two pawn structures that makes this so much more favorable than a usual position. So if you imagine how white is going to mobilize his pawns, it's fairly straightforward. You are going to start rolling your pawns. Can you say the same thing about black's position? Can black freely roll his pawns? Black's majority isn't mobile right now, that's correct. And also notice, because Garry has a pawn on h5, all these pawn moves that would try to facilitate the majority, the pawn majority on the king side, doesn't work, because white would just capture, and suddenly they wouldn't be a strength but a liability in the position. So therefore, Garry makes sure that these pawns are over-defended and basically clamping down on black's king side. So this is one of the reasons why deep opening preparation is key at the highest level. They look for a position where the prospects will favor them in the long run. And in this case, black really doesn't have a lot of hope of counterplay. The counterplay will always be passive and will always be most of trying to make or holding the position for a draw. Rook d8, bishop e3, bishop d6, f3. Notice that Garry is very quick to get rid of all of his weaknesses so he can play for two results. Does this count as a minority attack? Well, in a minority attack, you attack the majority of pawns. In this case, you're more like clamping down on black's structure. So you're just making sure it doesn't run away. But that's actually a great point. There is the famous game between Korchnoi versus Karpov, where he does the exact same thing, but on the other side of the board, he's actually just clamping down, but on the queen side. Okay, so we look at this position. we also have to identify whether trades will favor us or will it favor black. And remember, white has the space advantage. So that should be sort of a giveaway. Well, in reality, we really shouldn't trade that much. Rook c8, c4. However, for now, they can't quite take on e5 because the a-pawn is hanging. Standard guidance not to trade when you have more space. That is correct. a5, a4. Keeping black from advancing too much. And also restricting counterplay. So you'll see in other games how they treat the position, but it is quite exemplary how Kasparov treats this position. He doesn't let Vishy cross over to the other side. White already has reached black's camp. So not only does he have the center control, but he also has a pawn on h5 already infiltrating black's position, that is. So knight d7, bishop d2. Going after another weakness. Bishop c7, bishop c3. Knight takes, d takes, c5. Okay, so white, of course, still managed to have an advantage. However, because Vishy is defending skillfully, there is a newfound danger. What's that newfound danger we got to look out for? And in fact, something that Carlsen never really liked. In fact, was something that he even denied exist. Fortresses. So Vishy, even though is in a worse position, but if there is no breakthrough, a better position is not even winnable. So white will have to tread carefully so as Vishy can block off all the play in the position. But for now, Kasparov brings his king. Rook takes, king takes d1, rook d8, king e2, rook d7. But look out for this. If we start trading, or if we keep trading, we won't have enough pieces left to break through. So our duty in this position will be to find a way to create a target in black's camp that we can attack. Well, of course, this is a space-related position. However, in this case, there are some ways you can strengthen the position, and Kasparov obviously did. So for now, we can't really do too much on the queen side because of this potential b7 to b6 pawn move. So sometimes the answer to your question, where does my rook belong, is that there is no clear answer. For now, it really doesn't belong anywhere. So if it's not a rook move, and neither a bishop move, because the bishop is stuck defending the e-pawn, however, it is still in the best position it could be, that leaves us with pawn moves. f4. Very good. Well done, chat. f4, threatening f5, but also threatening g5. Let's say black would ignore this. White could consider pawn to g5 as well, because if you manage to trade, then you get a majority, and white has potential ideas of opening up the g file and potentially the f and h for the rook. And once the rook infiltrates, there are very real chances of winning the game. Not to mention that white can also create a pass serve at h6. But apart from that, there's also the idea of f5. Of course, Vishy does not let Garry go play g5. Bishop g5, trying to go for counterplay. But as the bishop leaves, it actually leaves an important defensive idea open. So this bishop no longer is defending the b6 square. And that gives Kasparov, the legend, a new fancy idea. And that's actually one of the reasons you shouldn't decide too early where your pieces should go, because that could be a waste of time. That's why f4, f5 was so much stronger. Bring the rook. Exactly. First went f6, b6, but now he goes rook a1, rook a3, rook b3. So it was actually essential to get this pawn move over here, cutting off this bishop, so he can't go back and defend. And after b6, go rook a1, rook a3, rook b3, pressing that b6 pawn. So notice how efficient Kasparov can be with his pieces. First, he goes with the pawn storm, and once Vishy reacts, that actually gives him an easier time deciding where his rook will belong. And now it was much more clear-cut that his rook actually should go to a3, b3, and to attack and put the black's queenside under siege. Rook d8, rook a3, g takes, rook b3. Now, if you look at this, in general, pawns that are farther away, so passed pawns, potential passed pawns, are much more valuable than pawns in the middle because they're unlikely to become queens. That's just a simple reason. So bishop f4, rook takes b6, bishop takes e5, and this is a critical moment where, if I am correct, yes, this is the critical moment where actually Garry makes a slight inaccuracy. Rook b8 does not really work because of tactical ideas of bishop takes a5. Bishop takes a5, and there are just too many passed pawns for white. Here Garry goes for the trade on e5, which is a little bit hasty. But rook c6 would have been much, much stronger, as he's going to pick up those pawns and doesn't let Vishy get immediate counterplay. And his position is much, much better in that case. So takes, rook b5, rook d4, and suddenly Vishy is still fighting. Rook takes, takes, b3. Never forget, anytime you play an ending, make sure you over-defend your pawns. And it is still clear that white is the one pushing because his pawns are just more dangerous, because these pawns are going to be stopped by the king on e2. Rook g3 takes, rook takes a5, f5. Check, king g7. Okay, question is, which pawn should white start pushing? Which pawn will become stronger? Remember, we reached the endgame zone. And in the endgame zone, there are new pieces that gain and have newfound powers. You can push the h-pawn, that's my feeling too. But that's just a hunch. And he goes for the c-pawn. And you might be thinking, why not the a-pawn? The thing is, if you push the a-pawn, black is going to catch the other pawn and just stop this other pawn from behind. When in fact c5 is better because the king is closer. Because if this king would ever catch up to the c-pawn, it's game over. Because the king actually be nursing and supporting the c-pawn. With the a-pawn you can't do the same thing. It's just far away from the white king. So c5 played, rook c8, c6, rook e8. You don't actually have time to defend this because c7 and promotes. So I have to go here. Rook takes e6, f4, check, king d3. Now, black is actually very close to equality. However, with time trouble looming large, it's quite an arduous defense. Now, here black goes rook c5, king d4, king e4, check, rook c3, and because of time trouble, white actually moves the king, but white has a brilliant way to win already. Can we spot the winning idea for white? Well, king e5, white is still going to have to face pawn pushes. King e4, all these king moves, that's very similar to what Garry did, but that's not the direction we're going for. f6, f3. So you have to understand what is the biggest danger you're facing in this position as white. It's the f-pawn. And what actually is hard to notice is that the rook this time is even stronger from g2. f3, rook f2, king h8, king d6, king g7, king d7, check, c7. Well, that's not exactly. So king g7, turns out that rook f1 is an incredibly strong move, because at the end of the day, if the black king tries to come forward, then you push the pawn, check, and you just walk away from this pawn. And there is this beautiful tactical shot. Now, rook f1 is an incredibly difficult move to play. But it turns out that black really doesn't have anything else to do. I can't really make any other progress apart from going to f6. But in that case, as I showed, this is the beautiful idea. And the other thing is, if black does nothing, does something meaningless, at the end of the day, you say you keep on checking, white is going to have a fairly nice little idea that wins on the spot. So let's show our endgame skills. Let's see how white can just win the position. And that's actually why the rook is preferred to be in front of the pawn in this case, and not behind it, because it would lose a lot of tempo. And also, this is the key idea that otherwise wouldn't necessarily work. Yep, it is indeed the Lucena. Rook b1, over defending the b file. Notice if you do this, I still check you forever. Now, of course, the problem is the king was there, but let's say the king moves to g7 instead. Here, I would just keep checking you forever, and whenever you move away, I attack the pawn. So it is of utmost importance you put the rook on b1, and even if you go f2, I just go king b8, and rook b3, I just capture and promote. So you have no ways of saving this position. This pawn is neutralized, and so is the idea of checking from behind. And that is actually an important lesson from this endgame to learn. You may want to defend frontally, especially when your rook can help out with the defense. Now, the game ended in a more tragic way. So he went king d4, here king e4, check, king h8, played this move which was really bad and it's already losing, takes, rook d6, king g4, check, c7, and resigns. The king is cut. This is also an underrated way of cutting the king. And not only is that cut, the h pawn is going to run down the board, and you can't stop both of them. So you could take away from this game, well, you want to know where your rook belongs. It's always very tricky in these endgames. But first and foremost, choosing the right opening is key when you're playing elite level. So let's take a look at another game featuring the very same opening. So this is Vladimir Kramnik versus Evgeny Bareev. Let's fast forward. Here, bishop e7 takes, queen d3, queen d5. There is a little bit of a difference, but it is practically negligible. It was this one in the previous one, and also the queen was on e2. But this time, white actually doesn't go rook e1. Also, it doesn't work as well because the pawn has been committed to c4. So there are some little details, like here it takes. Actually, still works because it's defended. But in this game, Kramnik already doesn't go rook e1, but goes bishop e3 immediately. Knight d6. Okay, so we reach this endgame. Very same endgame, but different moves. So it is, in some sense, unique. How should white continue? Yes, that is true. Rook e1 actually doesn't work because of knight f2, knight g4. Good point. So this is what we call an in-betweener. It's not really an ending, but it's still sort of a middle game, right? So there are some dangers still lurking in this position. Now, if we would push the b2 pawn, would that be too big of a weakness or not? That's a simple question. Either we're afraid or we're not afraid. Chat, are you afraid or you're not afraid of no ghosts?
I'm not afraid. I push it.
Push it? Okay. I believe b3 was indeed played. So in this position, with the queens already off the board, all these squares, well, if they can exploit it immediately, then we'd care about it. But of course, it's more of an ending. This looks more of like the ending type of position. And it doesn't really strike much fear in White's heart. Knight e5 is a little bit risky because you're underestimating potential ideas of trying to capture the e5 knight. So you always have to be careful. Black's position, even though passive, it can become quite venomous if you don't tread carefully. And that's actually one of the reasons it is so popular. So b3, and here Bareev actually plays the stock idea, and the idea that is actually quite nice in these positions and what Black should be aiming for. Black definitely has to go for some level of counterplay, or else he's going to end up in the previous game, as the previous game shows, which was featured between Kasparov and Anand. So this is an ending, yet bishop f6 and b5 is a typical idea in the Caro-Kann. Now, White does not really want to commit to c5, not just yet at least, because it would definitely weaken that square, and Black may actually take advantage of that. And slowly but surely, it'd be Black who would be preferred. So knight d2, keeping the tension. And here, Bareev plays king d7, but I'm not a huge fan. I definitely think the king should still castle. And even though the position is technically an ending, the king will actually find itself in a crossfire. King d7, well, in general, Black doesn't have like an easy way or any concrete way of taking advantage of this structure. And also note that Kramnik made sure that none of these jumps actually work. So king d7, and that is definitely a dubious idea. King c2. So Kramnik is ready to over-defend those pawns. So in this sense, this whole opening is somewhat double-edged. Even though White has the extra space, White does have to tend for the d4 pawn and then later the c4 pawn, because they will be heavily attacked and bombarded by Black's pieces. Bishop d8, not a lucky move, and in fact something we should try and punish. Yeah, bishop d8 is actually not that great. Now, it is not a bad idea to recall how people played in previous games. However, every position is unique in itself, so trying to use the same idea all the time will not provide you the desired results. So black's move of bishop d8 is somewhat suspicious because it loses a bit of control. Which squares got a bit loose because of that move? No, the bishop never really controlled the d5 square. The e5 square. Knight f3. And that's actually an important thing to notice, that whenever your opponent makes a move that is slightly passive and moves away from the center, you should always look around if you can take advantage of that. In fact, Kramnik spots a tactical idea that you can't quite take here because knight e5 check and I can capture back with a tempo. So bishop f6, knight e5 check, you can't still take it because of the e and the immediate pin. King c7, c5. Now he goes for c5. Bishop takes e5, d takes, knight c8. So far, so good. Bareev probably hopes to get the knight to d5. However, there's some weaknesses in black's position that Kramnik can go after, and he did. Rook h3. So that's one of those things. You're going for the template ideas. Chess is more than just the templates. That's actually the greatest misunderstanding in chess. Everyone who never played a chess game thinks it's about templates. Oh, I go f4, f5. This is what I saw. This is what I need to do. I win. I'm a genius. Look at me. That's not what chess is about. Chess is about subtlety. Chess is about understanding the little differences. All those little things that seemingly don't matter. That little difference that Kramnik didn't actually go f4 but went for rook h3. Why did he go rook h3? Well, he's putting immediate pressure on the f7 pawn. Indeed, a very clippable moment of Kramnik's play. Knight e7, rook f3, here. Rook d6, just landing the eagle in black's position. And it's quite painful. It is a little bit reminiscent of rook a3, rook b3. Exactly. So there are synchronicities in these positions. a5, g5. Doing the same idea that Kasparov was hoping to get. But this time Kramnik actually gets there. Takes, bishop takes, knight f5. Should we or should we not give up our rook on d6? Should we?
I think we should.
Okay. Why? Why should we sacrifice the exchange?
I want to
Mhm.
because there will be a really good passer in the future.
Mhm.
So
Okay.
that's why.
That's a good point. However, let me play devil's advocate here, if you don't mind. Do you have a good position as white?
Pretty mid. Pretty mid.
Mid.
Yeah, mid.
Well, can black do anything? So if I don't do nothing with white, I just move my rook away, black can't really do too much. Would that change your mind?
Why can't we do
Not really, because you can't actually put your rook in front of mine, because I own the d8 square, and if I start doubling up on the d file, I may be able to get in, and it's almost checkmate.
Oh.
So whenever you're trying to make a decision, of course, you consider the sacrifice. But you gotta keep in mind, do I have a position that has a plus, has an advantage? If you already do, you don't need to sacrifice. So rook d1, a4, b4. Again, no counterplay for Bareev. He's avoiding all of that shenanigans. Kramnik is. King c8, rook d3, rook a7, rook d8, take, take, king b7. And you can already sense something's absolutely off in black's position. All right, so we got a great position here as white. What should we do? Just remember all your endgame studies. And that should be good enough for you to find white's plan. I can see everyone is looking forward for some fireworks. However, a rook is still a rook. It's worth a lot. And again, that's sort of a distraction. This is an endgame, right? You gotta bring the king. You gotta bring the king. King c3, king d3, king e4. Bring in the king. So first and foremost, never forget, number one rule, the king needs to participate in the endgame. This is the moment, though, where white can play a dazzling little move. He actually waits for it. Rook d8, king f4, check, check, here, king c8, and now he plays that beautiful idea. That makes this a brilliancy. Black really couldn't do anything in between. He was just stalling and waiting around. Bishop f6, very good. Quite a beautiful move. The point is, you can't quite capture, because I capture back. And white's simple plan is, I'm going to go king g5, h6, h7. If you ever sacrifice the knight, it's game over. My king is just going to go to g7 and you're lost. So rook c8, although black can still try, so let's take how that works. Takes, takes, king g5, king d7, here. Well, yeah, so knight d4, h6, knight f3, king h5, knight e5. So we do need to calculate a little bit. Even though we should exude some confidence that we are actually winning. But okay, that actually gives credit to Kramnik's calculation. You got to be accurate, but you are winning. F4, I managed to come back home. And also I might be able to capture that pawn. So you may have to be quick with your pawn. H7, of course. Knight G6.
King H6.
King D7.
And now King G7.
Yes. E5.
And now I. Takes on F7.
You got better. Much simpler. You are on the right track, but you don't even have to take on F7.
Oh, so it's H8 queens.
Take.
King take. And now King G7. And now A3.
And it's gone. Zuxman. You can make a single move. Black runs out of moves. Of course, if you go A3, F3, that is the same thing. So notice that white purposefully never pushed this pawn, because in endings, if you have that extra tempo, that can be a game changer. Remember that, because that's key. Pawn pushes, be fairly conservative with that. And otherwise, the position just collapses, takes King G5, and Bareev resigns because white is just going to pick up the G and the E pawns, and there's just no hope for a successful defense. So, a magnificent game by Kramnik, where he completely dominated black's position and black's play. Now, surprise, surprise! I didn't talk much about Vishy, but this is the moment to talk about Vishy right now. Vishy, undoubtedly one of the best players of all time. I would put him in top 3. Now, they used to call him the Lightning Kid, but I really think we should just call him the grandfather of Indian chess, because that's who he is. He was the one who put India on the map, and in fact is one of the very few players who won all forms of world championships. Very few other players even managed to get there. Also notice that Vishy was a bit like Bobby Fischer in the sense that he faced a slew of ex-Soviet players and succeeded with getting the chess crown, and all kinds of versions: knockout, not knockout, round robin, and the classical world championship match and matches. So even though Vishy is not extolled enough, let's give Vishy his due, and let's see how he actually learns from a previous loss and takes up Ponomariov with the same defense he faced when he was facing Garry Kasparov. Just playing the exact same weapon he had to face before. Bishop f4, knight e4 takes, c4 takes, bishop e3, castles. So we already understood from the previous games what white should be aiming for. So as we already kind of built a little bit of a game collection of what's happening here, finding the moves for white shouldn't be that hard. So let's try to predict or guess what Vishy did in this position. Knight e5. And what will be your plan?
My plan is to put the knight on e5 beautifully on an outpost and then have some plans of kicking the e4 knight with square.
Okay, so knight e5 is a beautiful move. Is there any weaknesses in white's position that needs extra defenders?
I think it's g6, right?
Well, yeah, but also remember you've got a pawn that wandered off a little bit. So right now, of course, you have a rook defending it, but in the long run, you'll have to make sure it has pawn support. Otherwise, those pawns can become isolated from the white camp. Yeah, so knight e5, indeed, exactly what he played. f3, knight g3, so he's sort of sabotaging the play. Rook h3, obviously you don't want to drop this pawn. So remember, this is an ending. You can't just give up pawns willy-nilly unless you have immediate counterplay. Like here, black could take. So Vishy, of course, defends it. Bishop f2, rook d8, g4. So g4 actually has this dual purpose of not just chasing the knight away, but over defending these pawns and creating this beautiful pawn chain, which is typical to the Caro-Kann. Knight e7, knight d3. Again, a very strong move. And you can see how chess is evolving. In previous games, black was allowed to capture on e5, but Vishy doesn't want to allow it this time. b5, we of course go b3, bishop c7, rook h1. Now, this is that little move that most of the time not many talk about, but it's a sign of a really, really strong player, a true GOAT. Why? Because you're making sure that you don't have any bad pieces. This rook on h3 seems okay right now, but it's sort of pointless, and it'd be much more useful protecting the d1 rook, and also it may join the battle via rook he1. So rook h1 is a very strong move. Bishop b6. Knight c5. And knight c5 looks surprising. However, Vishy understands the position better. And again, that goes back to the deep understanding and the deep preparation of these players. Vishy is not afraid of the doubled pawns on the c file after the trade on c4 and c5 because he notices a big difference. What's the biggest difference between white's position and black's position? And I really want to focus mostly on the light pieces. The bishop on f2 is just stronger than the knight on e7. The knight on e7 is actually hindered by his pawns on c6, and again, note the pawns on h5 and g4. There's just no way for that knight to come about and get to a better spot. So yes, these pawns look loose, but there's no way for Ponomariov to go after them. And also that knight on e7 is sort of stuck. Now in the long run, what do you think white could do to actually build a much bigger advantage? What would be a long-term plan? Because it's one thing that the knight on e7 is bad, but that in itself won't win you the game. Note that there are some targets in black's position, the a7 pawn, c6 pawn. But for now, there's no way to get to them. You can't quite move your king, and here you got to be careful with king moves because rooks are still on the board. That's actually an exception. Always be careful when the rooks are still around. Okay, and if I capture back after rook takes d8?
I thought it would be 1.
Okay, and you want to infiltrate. Okay. You could also consider, in the long run, to get your bishop along this diagonal. So, always notice if your bishop can participate or deny a square for your opponent. Because if you manage to deny the d8 square, you can freely enter via d7, and then that rook is going to spell disaster all along the 7th file. 7th rank. So e5, rook d6, also annoying because you can't move here, you drop the pawn. You can't take because I'm going to create a connected pass pawn, not to mention that it's also winning on the spot. So rook b8, rook d1. Double up. If you can double up, you always should in endings. Rook d8, takes, king h7, rook f8, f6. So Vishy actually manages to infiltrate, not the 7th, because Ponomariov defended that, but the 8th. But it's already kind of uncomfortable. There's no counterplay. The whole concept of white's opening, that white actually has a quasi extra pawn on the other side, as black is completely paralyzed on the king side. However, that's one thing. You still have to win the game. And you have to create a strong passer for white. But in Vishy, you should trust. And I hope you'll find this brilliant idea from Anand. So right now we don't have a way to infiltrate. And that rook is annoyingly placed from a white perspective. How can we try to lure it away, or chase it away rather? Well, if you move your bishop around, that doesn't really lure the rook away at all. Exactly. So white gets ready and starts rolling the a-pawn up. And that will give Vishy an access to the b7 square. a4, the pawn is heading to a6. g6, a5. Now, of course, you never can go there because I just pick up the pawn and I'm winning. Takes, rook b8, a6, bishop a5. Now, this wouldn't still win yet because black can go king e6. So bishop a5, knight f5, bishop b6. Rings a bell? This is the counterpart of Kramnik's game versus Bareev, where bishop f6 was played. So there is a level of synchronicity in this game too, where of course you can't touch this because I'm just going to start promoting. And this knight is just so far away and is denied so many vital squares, it can't stop Vishy from winning. And now the whole line of defense just collapses for Ponomariov. Check. Rook c8. Of course, you still can't touch it because cb. Rook takes. Check. King b4. Takes. King a3. Rook b6, making sure there are enough defenders and the king may slide through just to avoid the knight checks. Takes. c6, and that pawn is rather far away. c7, check, king a3, and the king will run away, so he didn't even give this check, but at the end of the day the king would just run through and the c-pawn promotes. Really well selected games, synchronicity everywhere. I agree. So I really hope all of you enjoyed these games. Hope you learned a thing or two how the GOATs prepare and actually come up with a game plan. And look at that. Sometimes having a selection of games before you play a variation might come in handy. Thank you so much.